Welcome, my friends. So I'm just kind of setting up and getting ready to do this presentation. And I was thinking like I'm going to talk about middle adulthood, right? And it's like, what better way to show it? Like this summer I turned 40, technically switched to the middle adult category, trying to get the kid to sleep while trying to record a presentation for work. It's like sort of characteristic of this stage, right? And so at this stage we're going to be looking at this idea of how do people sort of deal with this developmental crisis around like, are you doing things that matter and that are meaningful and that are contributing? Welcome to the presentation, middle adulthood. I love teaching this class. You're fantastic students and people. Hope you're having a good day, and let's get into it. Charlotte says hi. Charlotte, say what's up. She's like, oh hi. Yeah, she likes you. She doesn't know what to think. She was like half asleep a second ago, but then when I had my aggressive start, I kind of woke her up. But anyways, cheers. Good to see you. This will be fun. All right, my friends, welcome. And I just wanted to take a quick second to say that if anyone needed to connect around anything around their projects or just needs to connect about anything, I've in the past like done Zooms or even phone calls with NIPSing students, so I'm open to that. And I wanted to say, like, usually Mondays I don't teach at the college. Basically, I'll say this real quick, but I basically teach like Tuesday and Thursday in the afternoon and Wednesday and Friday in the morning. So I could basically meet like the other times. So basically, like, I could meet anytime Monday, Tuesday morning, Thursday morning, Wednesday afternoon, Wednesday afternoon, Friday afternoon. All right, so if you need to reach out, please let me know. All right, my dear friends, welcome to the presentation. Now you're like, okay, Mike, what? This is like the third welcome slide. But that one Zoom one I just wanted to have in there to just kind of reach out to you a little bit that way. And then, to be honest, I was trying to get Charlotte to sleep and couldn't get her to sleep. So I just was like, I'm just going to rip the first slide like that. And I thought that, like, part of the reason to do that is just to be a bit personal with you too, right? And just realize, like, weird times, but I really do appreciate the opportunity to like take some time and chat with you about these topics, and I hope that you get something from it. And I know that I'm like acting like I don't know that you're watching. It's like you're such an awesome group of students, and I know you're watching, and I see your projects, and obviously through our communication, it's like, I love you. I rant about it every week. Okay. And part of it is because I'm gonna keep becoming an old man now, and it's like I struggle with that question of, is what I'm doing, doesn't matter? And Erickson's idea is that, like, that's like so characteristic of this stage of life, where it's like, am I generating anything that matters, right? In terms of family, in terms of career, in terms of life, in terms of philosophy, in terms of spirit, and what's the relationship between sort of who I am and the next generation? And do I feel like I have some sort of meaningful connection with them, right? And it's like Erickson said that that's actually the essential thing. That's like where you're gonna find your well, in his idea, like your key developmental challenge or your crisis or your dilemma, right? Or whatever language you want to use. It's basically like, this is the task you got to deal with. You got to figure out, is the way that you decided to live your life producing results that you're okay with? Like, do you feel like you're actually generating some? Remember, like, the word generativity is sort of like, I'm kind of using this like long rant to explain this word, because this is sort of the core word of this stage, is like generativity, or to generate, to make something, to make something of value. It's like, you could say that when I give, not to like over personalize it, but if I like give you an assignment and then you like do some cool response to it, it's like, honestly, I'm not over hyping it when I say it's like kind of like a gift, right? Like, I feel lucky that at this stage of my life I have like my day job with the college, and then I have this other opportunity to basically make videos for the NU digital classroom. You know, it's like, you know. Okay, so anyways, generativity involves an interest in establishing and guiding that next generation, right? So I want you all to be twice as good at making these videos as I am. So rearing children, so yeah, so it's all kinds of, and so like I'm using this student example because that's a significant one. And then it can also include things like my kids, right? And you can start to see how it's like the biggest thing. It's basically like, do I feel like if you're not feeling like you're contributing that or generating that, you start to wonder with these questions like, well, why am I working so hard? Why am I running myself into the ground? Why am I stressing over things if it doesn't matter, right? Things not mattering become very threatening to your ego at this stage. What do you mean things don't matter? You're working awfully hard for things not to matter, right? So what you're doing mattering in this like most existential kind of deep purpose sense, whether we're talking about raising kids or teaching or mentoring or taking roles kind of in your community civically, like in your like me, I'm the street rep for my street in the neighborhood association. It's kind of just to like clean up the local park and do like fireworks in the summer and a couple barbecue kind of things for parents and kids. But it's like those little things are huge. It's like if you want to really have an impact in your community, just join your local community association and help organize a couple barbecues for kids and families and people that just hang out and talk and have coffee for the parents and whatever. It's like, I don't know. That's like community. That's like real community building. And then this idea of that matters because you're sort of, well, I say like may continue through old age, but just this idea of like wanting to feel that you have something to pass on. That's probably the way to say it. In some kind of meaningful way. So then with the flip of this, right? So with Erickson, we're always going to be talking about these crises and dilemmas, right? So it's always like this two-sided thing that the goal is this, and it's a goal because not only because that's ideal and growth promoting or sort of pushing you in a positive way down your developmental path, it's also that there's a risk associated with not accomplishing it, right? And you know that by now that we've been doing that at every stage, whether it's like right at the beginning and we're talking about the baby establishing trust and the risk of not establishing trust, or mistrust is the term, basic mistrust. And that's like such a basic mistrust. Just at the most core level, you don't trust. Because remember, basic in the senses doesn't mean simple. It means core. Okay, so sorry. Both my chairs, the leather chair, like this office chair, is squeaky. This wooden chair is kind of squeaky. I'm on the search for a completely squeaky-less chair. But anyways, didn't need to say that out loud. So stagnation is, just to link back to before I lost my point, the idea is that if you don't establish that sense of like having some kind of meaningful connection to the next generation that you actually care about and you feel like they might actually care too, and it's like that if you have that's incredibly not just cool but linked to positive mental health, right? Because mental health wasn't really the language then. Like Erickson wouldn't have probably ever said mental health. I wouldn't have imagined. but it's clearly what he means. So like this idea of stagnation, right? That, and I like that picture. I've used that picture for years to represent this concept of basically stagnant water, right? Like that pond, and like just picture that pond as being like fairly small. It's like basically a pond of water that's completely encircled by rock, so it's completely dead. There's no like water going in or out, so that's just going to be like, well, it's just going to be like bugs and bacteria city, right? So you'd call that stagnant. It's the opposite of a flowing river. A flowing river is basically the opposite of stagnant. Stagnant means like stuck. Stagnate. I was gonna like act like, and there's some like Latin root to the word stag. I don't know. Stagnation. It's not just, and we all experience stagnation at like the smaller levels, right? Like stagnation basically means just when you feel like you're like, I don't know, if I'm being honest, I've felt stagnation during this whole last few years, where it's like sometimes it's like by the time the kids are in bed, you've sort of lost your steam to do work, but you feel like you want to do that work, but then you also don't want to do. It's like you're just kind of like you're feeling like you're not in your groove, sort of. You're feeling like you're not doing what you're wanting to be doing, and it's like what Erickson's saying is like sometimes the worry, or what like can happen is when, or what the worry is that that will become like the kind of dominant aspect of your psychology. This failure to, well, just think of what the word personal impoverishment would mean. That at like a personal psychological self-talk, just understanding of the world level. And I think you'll notice this, and then the next time we're going to talk about like integrity and that kind of like the kind of final stage. But I want you to sort of notice that at this point, the psychological flip towards looking back. And think about it, if you're 20, or if you're 22 or 25 or something, it's like, I know I'm old man mainland, but I'm not that much older. I am a lot older, but because I was telling someone like a sports story from high school and realizing that it was over 20 years ago, and it's like, oh man, yeah, I'm getting old. But again, you're all helping me not feel stagnation. And it's like, that's Erickson's point. It's not like you are or you aren't. It's like, that's the struggle you're dealing with. Okay. My mind rebels at stagnation. Give me problems. Give me work. Give me the most abstruse cryptogram, like a number code, or the most intricate analysis, and I'm in my own proper atmosphere. But I abhor the dull routine of existence. I crave for mental exaltation. Arthur Conan Doyle, who when I've done this slide live, I always ask students if they can tell me who that is. Sherlock Holmes wrote Sherlock Holmes, but that's an awesome quote, right? That like, and this, we're gonna see that this is like not just that it's like more interesting to stay mentally alert, but this is gonna be linked from the perspective of a lot of you who are going to be maybe working with seniors in the future, whether from a psych perspective, or maybe some of you are working more with like whether it's in actually helping with the cognitive decline, or whether it's in like an assisted living scenario, providing more like I don't know, like therapeutic recreation or therapeutic art exercises, or I'm kind of getting lost in multiple points, but another thing I wanted to say is that's actually something to keep in mind, right? If you're at the stage of beginning your career, that Canada has a massively graying population. Our population is getting significantly older. There's going to be huge amounts of work at the bottom and the top of the demographics, right? So with kids and with older adults. to link it back together so I'm not totally losing my point, one of the things that's going to be huge is the ability to maintain cognitive alertness, right? Because we know it's like one of the wildest studies is looking at like things like Tetris and stuff with older people that hadn't played it before, and how much it actually like can help keep them sharp. And one of the reasons is because of just the cognitive demand of it, right? So yeah, it's interesting. And then there's going to be the other flip side of it is going to be like after all this is done is going to be the catch up with the kids, right? So like this, in my opinion, which should be focused on interpersonal skill development and phonics completely. Yeah, so anyways, I've been thinking a lot about stuff like that. A few of you, when you've made videos, have made like blooper reels, and first of all, I love that concept. It's hilarious. Um, I could make some pretty killer blooper reels because this is my third try, for example, on this slide, and it's just because I kept getting tongue-tied explaining this first point because it's kind of, it makes sense, but it's weird to say, and I have it actually written kind of weird. But basically, the idea is that men that have a lot of regret about not having kids has effects on mental health. And so, but it obviously depends on whether that, for example, man wanted to have kids or not. Because obviously, like if someone never wanted to have kids and then they don't have kids, it's probably not going to affect their mental health to the same extent as somebody that really did want to. So actually, like how a man responds earlier to childlessness, to like not having a kid, is actually predictive of psychological health later. It's almost if, and this gets to a kind of interesting point, right? It suggests that raising a kid or having another kid, like say for example, if you if a male starts a relationship with a female that already has a kid, for example, like obviously, like thanks Mike for explaining, suggests that raising your own kid or helping raise another kid brings forward certain nurturing qualities that might be important for psychological growth and that might actually be protective functions. And what I mean by that is, like, just think for example of like, if I'm saying like, if you catch me on like a complainy day and I'm complaining about, oh, I gotta do this, and then with Charlotte, like my 6-month-old, we just sit around and like, I just like have her sit on my lap and I hold her hands and I like hit her hands onto my head and I'm like, oh, like pretending like she's like hitting me, and she just finds it hilarious and laughs and laughs and laughs, and we'll do that for like 10 minutes, and it's just like that I'm in like a better mood, and it's like, yeah, for your mental health, that's a protective factor or function or whatever word. It's like it's a protective influence on the whole system. So Erickson had this idea, right, that like it's basically about generativity, and then Valance revision, so Valance, that's just somebody's last name, who basically was like a supporter of Erickson's ideas and wanted to sort of add to the model, and thought that like, and I think his idea makes sense because basically all he does is he breaks the idea of generativity into sort of like work or professional life and then family. And we had sort of done that earlier, just sort of naturally. But this first stage, if you could have this idea of career consolidation, right? So just think of what consolidation means, is like, you can see the sort of the word solid in that, sort of like make it solid, right? To like, hope you're kind of not new at your job anymore. Which is kind of funny because I'm kind of at this stage and it's like, I'm not new to teaching, but I'm certainly new to teaching online and making videos and stuff like that. So like, it's kind of interesting how all this is different. A new social network, like, well, even think like not to continually talk about our specific relationship, but we're sort of a new social network for each other. Um, and yeah, it's like you're at the stage of your career where you're not sort of burnt out yet or whatever, or like at the end stage, and it's like if the better you do this stage, the less likely you'll be burnt out later. And you're also not really like, oftentimes not really like new, so you're in this middle stage. Okay, so this picture's kind of embarrassing, but it's like the reason I wanted to have this is because this is me and my wife's mom, right? So my mother-in-law just swimming at I think this was at Kilbear, but I wanted to use her as an example of this term, keeper of meaning, and think of keeper of meaning as sort of like, well, just what it sounds, that within social groups, some people are playing this important role of sort of sharing the story of the group with everyone. And my mom sort of is like that too, but it's like sort of the person that, if I know something about my brother, I probably heard from my mom. That's probably true if I heard something about my sister. And it's like we all sort of like know about each other because, well, we talk and everything, obviously, but like my mom sort of like organizes stuff, and so some of that is like really technical specific stuff, like organize, like making sure that everybody, you're getting together for all the birthdays and like Christmas and stuff like that or whatever. And then another part of it is sort of remembering the stories of the family, and remember this time with grandma and grandpa, and that stuff matters. That stuff matters so much. And as a society, we're not great at understanding sort of, and I'm guilty of it too, but how to like properly value that. It's like one of the most important things. It's like the secret ingredient to making groups work. I'll leave it at that. I think that's I think that's I just kind of randomly said that, but I think that's true. So you might notice a tiny change of pace, and it's like part of it is just that this course, especially like the first half, if you were in the fall course, starts a little bit more biological, like just by the nature of talking about how a human being develops. When you're starting at the beginning, you're talking about like a lot about the literal biophysical aspect of it. And then as we get more to like this stage, excuse me, of the life cycle, we start to get a little bit more philosophical and a little bit. I'm trying to make this deep point. And it's just me looking like a dummy holding out my plate. But I wanted to sort of, with this presentation and the next one, be a little bit more laid back and just sort of and talk about this, right? Because it's like, what are we doing here? It's like part of the understanding of this stage of life is this is the stage of life where you start to kind of get it. Oh, this is, so anyways, maybe I should just explain this of like, when I say what are we doing here, I mean like at this kind of deep level of like, what are you going to care about later, and what's an important thing really, like family and taking care of your own mental health and trying to be a good person and trying to contribute to the people around you, and maybe focusing on one or two causes that you feel like you can contribute to, and maybe having like a couple interesting hobbies, and maybe trying to like reach out to a couple old buddies. And it's like you can sit down and craft what meaningful is. Like to me, it's like now more than ever, it's like spending time outside with my loved ones and doing stuff and being goofy, and oh, that's my wife, like in the green shirt, and this is actually like her extended family. Yeah, who don't know, but they're in the presentation. But yeah, it's the point out, the reason to have this picture is also that I was kind of making the like my wife's mom organizes this kind of stuff, and like it's hard to kind of put a price or even a quantitative value on how much like doing this kind of stuff makes the relationships all sort of better, and how does that make like the Christmas gathering a little bit smoother, and how does that make maybe people in a little bit better mood when they go home in their own marriages, and then maybe in their own relationship with their kids. And like the butterfly effect of all this is sort of hard to analyze, but it's not nothing. So Levinson and Erickson argue for this idea of a midlife crisis, right? Because there's this, you hear about midlife crisis on TV and in movies and stuff like that, but what does the actual research say? And it's actually pretty interesting because you're dealing with all these different kind of tasks at this stage of life, whether it's, have their accepting your own mortality. Man, it's like how deep do you want to go with that? Do you want to just like immediately move on and list the next thing? Or if we actually stop and pause, it's like that's so deep. Right? Like coming to terms with this fact that human life is finite. That's like the most ultimately existential realization. And sometimes it happens in rough scenarios where people like lose a parent or a sibling or like a close friend, and you start realizing that things aren't a game, and that you don't have multiple swings at it, and you need to start, without sounding preachy, you need to start trying to be you need to just be, I don't know how to finish that sentence because it's just going to be different for you. We start to recognize, and that's kind of the thing, is you need to find out who you are and what makes sense for you. And right, because it's almost impossible to talk about to talk honestly about mortality and like death without talking about the idea that obviously like your beliefs around that have a huge impact on how you process that. So anyway, so there's and we'll talk about that a little bit more in the very final, or not one of the, it's not the final, but sort of the final textbook chapter. It's called Death, Dying, and Bereavement, and I'll talk about spirituality more then. Right, adapting to all these major changes and roles. Right, so like for example, I'm in the early stage of middle adulthood. I'm a young middle adult. I'm as young as a middle adult can get. Um, but what I'm saying, like, that was just me trying to be funny and failing. But this idea of adapting to major changes is like right now I have young kids. By the time I'm 50, they'll be obviously like younger, older, and starting to be teenagers and stuff. And then by the time I'm like at the end of the middle adult stage, they'll maybe even be like off at school or whatever. And it's like, so obviously, if at the beginning I'm basically have young kids, and at the end they're off at school, you see how like that's just another example of how all these things are happening at like such an interesting level. And it's, because that's the thing, it's like, the biggest realization I ever had about this was when my grandma died, who was one of my favorite people, my mom's mom, my grandma T, because her name was Teresa, and her Tess, and I don't know, just growing up we always called her Grandma T for whatever reason. And I remember when she passed, and I was like looking in her yearbook from high school, and it was like, it made, someone was like, you always had the best dribbles, or made like a basketball reference, and I was like, what? Because I really like basketball, and I was like, what? Grandma played basketball? And you sort of forget that, like, I don't know, I always just sort of saw her as an older person. It's like, you forget that, you know, we all only have so many trips around the sun, and yes, anyways, I'm kind of sorry. Uh, I should have told you to fast forward this. I just got a little ranty on the mortality, but again, it's like, that's kind of the thing, is like, now, if you're in a scenario where you feel like you've been living a life that you're relatively proud of, these kind of reflective exercises are a lot more positive. So, the research actually looking at midlife crisis is actually a little bit for and against, because it seems to not be something everyone deals with, but it seems to be something that is a fairly significant, like, if you just ask people, like, did you find this kind of period of life, did you have something you would define as a midlife crisis? Almost everyone knows what you mean by that term. And being 25%, it's like, that's still a minority, yeah, but statistically it's still a huge percentage, right? If that's like 1 out of 4, often triggered by life events rather than age. So that's actually one thing, right, that would be a pretty good question for you, for me to hit you with. But like, what's more likely to trigger it? And it's more, and it kind of makes sense, right? Like, it obviously, it's not like 52 midlife crisis, 53 you're 51 you're okay, 50 you're okay, but 52 you're gonna have a midlife crisis. No, it's like, it's obviously more life event triggered by things like, yeah, like the passing of a parent, difficult stuff like that. Midlife presents physical challenges, right? Like, and then obviously like the health aspect, and then also this last point, that variations in optimism are really significant. Like, people that are more positive, and not in a fake way, right? Like, that's one of the things, is people sometimes misunderstand that like, being optimistic is actually a courageous and brave position when you're also intelligent of what's really going on and you have your eyes open. Because it's easy to be jaded and negative and bitter, and sometimes it's courageous to be optimistic, and that actually has a huge effect on how we make sense of our experience, and it's actually a very important psychological variable. So at this point in the presentation, you're probably like, "Hey, Mike, you're getting a little ranty," and I certainly was. I let's just be honest. It was getting a little late into the old, uh, midnight sky. So, um, whatever. Had a good night's sleep. I'm refreshed. Let's get back to it. So, role transition is this idea that okay, so I'm going to talk about these terms: role strain and role conflict, and role transitions are just this idea of like moving between roles and dealing with the complexity of the individual roles. And like, role strain is this term that kind of refers to the idea of when an individual role is overwhelming you. So just again, think of roles as like this idea of like, right now I'm playing the role of your teacher, you're playing the role of student, I'm the role of dad to my kids, I'm the role of husband to my wife, I'm the role of son to my parents, and brother to my brother and sister, and brother and sisters-in-law, like family member to them. I'm the host of the Super Bowl party later today. It's like, we play all these different roles to everyone, almost like it makes, and I know that you know this, right? You're all like second year university students. You've probably heard of role theory before, but just, I want you to, at the most base level, just step back and think about it. It literally is like this idea of, if we're going to play in a movie, and it's like, okay, you be the doctor and you be the firefighter, go get the stuff you think you'll need for your role. It's like, you would sort of know how you're supposed to dress, what you're supposed to be holding, like, and so sometimes it's the specific roles we play. because on the next slide I'm going to say role conflict, which is where it's like tension between the roles. But role strain refers to this idea of like when we're being overwhelmed right now. So like say you're in like exam period and you're feeling overwhelmed, and it's almost all school that's feeling overwhelming. Or in a different example, say it's when, no, that's a pretty good example for this. So it's that specific role that's causing the strain. The stress occurs when a person lacks the resources needed to fulfill the role, right? It's like, and what are those resources? Those resources could either be time or ability, right? So maybe you're able to do the work, right? But you don't have the resource of time that you need to put towards it. So the kind of distinction I'm making here is role strain is when we're being kind of overwhelmed by the strain of sort of a particular role. So I have there like a midlife adult returning to college to learn new work skills, and the sort of anxiety around that. It's like this experience of being a student again, this role of being a student again is causing strain. Right, so each of us occupies multiple roles at the same time, which produces friction of various kinds. Which in a way is like laughably obvious, right? Like, obviously, like I would be, and again, it's like I try to like be honest, but I hope that it doesn't come across as being complainy, because like if I say a comment, like I could obviously like get content out quicker if my kids had slept better, right? And it's like, yeah, but okay. That brings us to the concept of role conflict. That was all just my segue. So then role conflict, right? It's like this picture of the lady is so perfect because it's like this mom running, and it's like got one kid under her arm, like carrying her like a firefighter. Another kid's like behind her. You can see like a clock, which adds the time element. You can see like lunches. You can see her coffee spilling. Her work stuff. Her money and wallets coming out of her purse. It's like she's like dropped a brush. You can kind of see right beside her body, because it's like you can tell she was like kind of half got herself ready. And this is this idea of you're playing all these different roles. Well, what happens when there's conflict between those? What happens when two or more of these roles are at least somewhat incompatible? Right? They just like my tough part of the week. So again, and part of it is it's like I gotta stop apologizing for it, because it's like obviously I'm going to be using personal examples. I'm the only one talking. But like for me, it's like Wednesday and Friday mornings are the toughest, because those are the days when I need to get kind of help Julie get Evie ready to go, and Julie has to also be taking Charlotte with her, because most other mornings Julie usually takes her, but I usually keep the baby for the morning. That's just sort of the routine we've established. But then Wednesday and Friday we can't do that, because I start teaching right when Evie starts school, like at the exact same time. Right, so that's kind of an example of role conflict, where it's not necessarily that the teaching's overly complex, or like overly strainful, I should say, or that like getting the kids ready in the morning is overly strainful. It's them both being aimed at 9 o'clock that's stressful. Simultaneously caring for teenage children and aging parents can also, that's a that's a strain too, right? We're going to talk about that, a specific word for that in a minute. So I don't know, maybe this is like me being old and finding it funny, but I think skilled diplomacy is a kind of funny word to use about relationships, but it might actually be the smartest. And if you actually view, okay, marital satisfaction and stability tends to increase with time, right? And you've heard me rant about this before, that it's misleading when you hear people talk about things like marriage and how, half marriages end in divorce, and it's like, okay, but what you're really saying with that said is that sometimes people rush into things. I don't even know if that's what it means. because that set has to be contextualized. And again, this is like a more general point about research methods, but it depends what you're asking, because and I gave you that idea that, right, it drops to like super low if you get past 8 years. And it's interesting that part of that is because a lot of you know this if you've been dating the same person for a long time, that you sort of have the same fight over and over, right? So it's like, it's not like every single fight or argument that you have is like completely unique topic wise. Just think about it. It's almost laughable to think about that. Is all the arguments you get in with your boyfriend or girlfriend unique topic wise? Or they tend to have some themes? And if they tend to have some themes, now think about that. Just think about it as if you're thinking about someone else, not yourself, because it's really easy to personalize. And keep in mind, I don't know your individual situation, so, but if you're going to be having these kind of same recurring, potentially negative patterned interactions, the more healthy those can become, the clearer the communication, the slower to anger, the more to, or the increase in maintenance of respect throughout the duration of the argument. It's basically skilled diplomacy, right? So traditionally the word diplomacy would mean like a diplomat, that's where you get the word diplomat, diplomacy. It's like where you'd have a diplomat, a person from one country, theoretically, like let's assume everything's perfect. You have like somebody from one country coming and meeting with somebody else from another country to make a plan that helps both countries. And that you call that diplomacy. That's like that'd be like a definition of diplomacy. And so skilled diplomacy, it's like basically this idea that if you're going to be with somebody for a really long time, let's just be honest, human beings tend to get into repetitive patterns of arguments with loved ones. I don't know, show me evidence that that's not true. So the more you get, the better you get at handling that as a team, right? Because I'm not talking about how to use like rhetoric to dominate conversations with your partner, because then what do you want, a dominated partner? It's like, it doesn't, if you're actually wanting a long-term, really stable relationship of mutual respect, it has to be team-based. Okay, so the next term I want to kind of talk about for a bit is this word sandwich generation. Okay, so think of what this means. Like, think of what a sandwich is. Think about a classic combination sandwich. That's what they used to be called. Isn't that awesome? So like a piece of bread, you know, a little bit of mustard or mayo or however you like, butter, however you like to make your sandwiches. And then, you know, whether you're talking about a meat-based sandwich or hopefully you got some nice cheese on there, a little bit of lettuce, maybe like a little onion. Maybe you're like the teacher, like a little bit of mushroom on there, maybe like a little tomato. That combination sandwich. I don't know. I watched an old cartoon and they called it a combination sandwich, and for some reason, to my brain, that's amazing. But anyways, so think of just sandwiches. Like the picture there captures it perfectly. It's the guy standing with the kid he's taking care of on one side and his parent that he's trying to take care of on the other side, right? As if metaphorically in this scenario, those are the two pieces of bread and he's stuck in the middle, and it's like sandwiched. You know what that would mean, right? That pushed from both sides. And now think about what that means when you're talking about actually providing care, because that actually means a lot, and that actually means a lot of responsibility and obligation. And I should sit closer to the mic. And because like, just even think about if you're financially supporting in both directions, and if you're time supporting in both directions, and emotionally, and just in terms of things that you're worrying about. Right, so in middle adulthood, the family role can involve giving assistance in both directions of the generational chain. That's a pretty good way of saying it. In both directions of the generational chain, right? So the older generation and the younger, helping support grown children or growing children. Right, so a lot of times that picture obviously represents the younger generation as a baby, but sometimes it's like the more kind of common situation would be somebody that's like in their 50s with maybe kids that they're helping in school as like university or college, and then older parents, and let's just be honest, with a class as big as this, like there's probably a few of your parents in that. My mom's not really in that scenario anymore because me and my brother and sister are older, but she's sort of in the situation of like, oh, she is in the situation actually. It's just there's an extra generation because my mom helps with. She doesn't really help with like me and my brother and my sister, but she certainly helps with our kids, right? So she's helping with, so that's the lower part, and she helps with her dad, who we'll talk about more next week. Her dad, who's 95, my grandpa, World War II vet, still sharp as a blade, you know. And so I want to tell his story a bit next week because he's an interesting, very interesting person. Served in the Navy. Okay. Kept German U-boats out of the St. Lawrence. So the sandwich generation. I got a little bit more I want to go on this. So this is kind of like the best picture for it. There's nothing too dramatic about the picture. It's basically just what we were talking about. But, you know, you see the parent, because here's the point I'm sort of making is, obviously this will affect the marriage satisfaction and things like that. I think like the picture's literally sort of a comic making the point that they're in the middle of a sandwich. That doesn't sound like a... But see, I was about to say like that's not an enjoyable situation, but it's like, well, it depends what you mean. Because it can be a very meaningful experience. But it can also be, the point of this isn't to show that it's like negative, and what it's to show is that it has this potential to burn out, this potential to strain resources when one individual is, or you know, in this case, even if it's the husband and wife or whatever, that are trying to shoulder the responsibility for maintaining kind of the emotional connections in both ways. And they're also giving more help in both directions, right? So between 40 and 65, adults tend to give more than they receive in both directions within a family. Now, so I'm in that age right now. And it kind of makes sense, right? It's like kind of like, okay, I'm not a kid anymore and I've been working for a while and I'm still at a point in life where I'm, you know, kind of at my max ability to work. Right, so a lot of times, like compared to like say my kids, or compared to like my parents who are old, starting to get older, right? But I think why awareness of this is important is to recognize some of the strain this can cause and how a lot of this can be supported, because a lot of people that are emotionally burnt out, well, there's just a lot that we know about what burnout is and about how it can be treated, and a lot of it isn't just about not doing the thing that's burning you out. A lot of it is how you're making sense of it and the meaning around it and the support you have and the ability to talk about it is really important with burnout, because actually being able to relate to other people that are burning out about similar things actually reduces burnout, which is usually not the case with things like that. Usually you don't want to like get in another group of people that have the same complaint as you and just talk about it, because it's just going to just build the monster in your head about whatever the thing you're worrying about is. But in this specific situation, when we're talking specifically about care-based burnout, debriefing with other people in similar situations actually is. So one of you should do a project on something like that at some point. That's a cool topic, I think. The psychotherapeutics of debriefing style conversations for people that are giving long-term burnout, long-term support to people in scenarios where burnout is a significant risk.
Around the world, people are feeling the squeeze. Global trends such as longer lifespans and decisions around when to start a family mean that there is a growing number of adults who are simultaneously caring for their children and their parents. They've become the sandwich generation. Anyone who's working and a member of the sandwich generation is going to be under a lot of pressure. The costs involved in raising a family and looking after your parents could force you to dip into your savings, take more time off work, and increase your stress levels. This has a knock-on effect on employers. A stressed sandwich generation worker can mean unexpected absence, health problems, poor engagement, and a hit to productivity. It could even lead to higher staff turnover. Some employers have already begun to tackle the problem and are looking at new ways to adapt, especially as more and more people join the sandwich generation and employee expectations shift. Employers that respond with empathy and flexibility can reduce turnover, improve productivity, and more deeply engage their people without disruption to the bottom line. The sandwich generation faces unique challenges and stresses, but strategies to support their needs can mitigate the impact. The result can be a healthy, confident, and engaged workforce that thrives on balance.
This picture makes me smile. As you get older, right? Like maybe the total number of friends you get is less, but one thing that I've noticed, and it's like, yeah, like oftentimes friendships stay like as intimate as and as close as before, and friendships tend to endure. And it's like I always use my buddy Chris Orson as my example of like someone I grew up playing hockey with, who like I might not see for the whole year, and then in the summer we might like get together, and he kind of lives up in the direction of my students, but not all the way there, but in like the Muskoka area. And I know North Bay is way farther, but it's cool because like I can go and like go on his boat and stuff, hang out with him, and it's like old times, right? Because we both sort of just understand that the other person's busy. Like there's no expectation that he's calling me like every week or something. It's like it's a kind of like just a mutual recognition that we're both busy, but that we're both friends, right? And it's kind of interesting because there's almost less. Well, and it all depends on the solidity of the base, right? Like if there's the foundation there. This is just a picture from okay, so the guy that's kind of closest almost to the camera, so that's like kind of 1, 2, 3, right before my ugly mug there that's like foreign. The one to the right of that is Uriah, and this is for his stag weekend. We went to like zip lining. This was actually at a zip lining place, and then his buddy, who's the guy in the middle with the beard, his brother, I mean, organized it, and then those are all my other buddies too. But every one of those guys, like I could not see for a long time and call at any moment. So here's another kind of interesting one. So this is the empty nest idea that you hear about on TV and stuff, and it's interesting because when you actually ask a lot of moms about what the experience is like of their kid moving out, they tend to describe it as positive. Now, that doesn't mean that they don't like having the kid around, obviously, but I think it's people underestimate how much everyone's also living their own life, right? And it's like the hardest people to think that about are like maybe your husband or wife or your boyfriend or like your parents or people that are so close to you, to think that they're all living their complete own life just like you are. And at a certain point it's like, yeah, obviously, but another point it's like, we kind of just view them as our mom or our dad or our brother. Like and to them we're that to them, and they have their whole world. And so sometimes the things that are positive are like the increased freedom, the being able to do whatever you want, but then what often happens nowadays is, so these words like adolescent, you can obviously see that that's sort of like a combo of the word adult and adolescent, or this idea of like kids in this kind of revolving door of like coming back to. And with the housing prices these days, I don't blame you. If you're able to stay with, if you're able to either rent with friends in some kind of shared payment scenario, or if you're able to like with family, or I'm obviously not gonna, I can't give generalized advice to 70 people because living situations are complicated, but I can certainly say that I can understand how people would see that as a logical move in the current housing market. I don't know if it's as bad in North Bay as it is in Kitchener. In Kitchener, an average house right now is almost $1 million. How wild is that? And when I was growing up, if you told me a house, like again, this is my old man rant of the day, second or third one. But if when I was growing up, you told me a house was going to be $1 million, I would think that that house would have like swimming pools on every floor, and would have like arcades, and would have like its own basketball net with that really nice rubber, and it would have like tennis courts. And I wouldn't be in my head picturing a normal house. Okay, Mike, you should edit that part out. My little rant on the Kitchener housing market. But yeah, it's because everyone's flooding Kitchener from Toronto, if you've never heard. I hope you like this class. It's like I'm just kind of talk to you, but I try to do more than just read slides. But these are sort of obviously my cue cards, kind of. And I think that, okay, so I'll just stop talking about the process so much. So grandparenting, right? So this next stage that, and obviously not everyone becomes grandparents, but that for a lot of people, it's one of the roles in life that's associated with the highest levels of satisfaction. Like people tend to really enjoy this, or well, most grandparents express high levels of satisfaction with this role, and we know that grandparents can have huge and positive impacts on the psychology of kids. And it's actually really amazing how much, even if a kid's in a tough situation, how much like a caring grandparent can provide stability. Right? And then there's also this other aspect of like, say for my parents, so I'm the oldest, and then my brother's 3 years younger, almost a little bit less, and then my sister's another 3 years younger, basically. But now I have Julie, and Brian has Val, and Laura has Chad. So it's like now my parents sort of have 3 other kids, right? In-laws. Or it's like for me, I have my sister, but then my brother has a wife, right? So there's another sister-in-law, and then my wife has 3 sisters. So I sort of have 5 sisters now. And for me specifically, it really feels like that because my wife's sisters are really close, so they're around a lot. So yeah, so it really does kind of feel like 5 sisters. But that's like a big change, right? That's a big change to like my immediate social life. And in that scenario, it's a very positive one. But it's kind of interesting, right? That's another way that life's changes, this changing around like the in-laws and stuff. Yeah, and I kind of forgot I have this picture in here, but this is my mom, and this is my my sister's son, Bennett. I was gonna say my daughter's cousin. And this will bridge into things I'll talk about at other points too, but when my mom was going through her chemo treatment, one of the things that really helped her was when Bennett was born, because I think it's like this, and she also started Kung Fu at that time, which I think was really important. And I think if you think about that from an identity perspective, it's like it allowed her to focus less on the cancer patient role or aspect of identity, and focus more on the grandmother and the Kung Fu student part. And I actually think that had a huge role in pulling her through it. Okay, so let's just get a few terms here, right? So about 30% of grandparents report being in, because this is all going to be self-report survey data. being in remote relationships, right? So this is like, obviously the word remote means when there's distance between, right? So a remote relationship would be a situation where the grandparents see the grandkids fairly infrequently, don't have a huge impact maybe on their development, and it's usually related to things like having physical distance between them, right? So, and that kind of makes sense. Like, obviously the reason that they're not having a huge influence on their development is because to have a huge influence on their development, they need to be there, right? They need to be present, at least digitally. Yeah, but oftentimes it's like, especially if you're not talking about like FaceTime and stuff like that, and you're going back even just a few years, it's like usually it's because of physical distance. At least that's the most cited reason. Okay, this is gonna be a shorter presentation, right? This one, just because kind of the context, it's like when we're talking about more biology stuff, I need to, I don't know, I'm wanting to make sure, because I know I kind of like to rant and talk about philosophy, and that's kind of my main interest. And so when we talk about biological stuff, I want to make sure that I'm giving you as good of information as I can. And sometimes that I think sometimes I got kind of long-winded. Okay, you're like long-winded, might you? No way. Uh, just over half of grandparents report having like a companion relationship, right? So companion, like a kind of friendship relationship, right? Where it's like, so this is the majority, right? So, or just over half, so over 50%, where it's a scenario where the relationship is like warm and enjoyable. And, I would say this would be like, say, for example, my daughter has a relationship like this with her grandparents, where it's like my parents, where they love seeing my kids, but they're also like, they like to have a sleep in on the weekend, or like they're happy to not be getting up in the middle of the night, right? And I think a lot of grandparents can relate to that idea. And then you see sometimes, right, so involved relationships. So this was where the grandma's playing a much more active role. This was true with us too, like earlier, especially with Evie, because it's just sort of a different scene then, right? Because when my first girl was born, it was obviously like pre-pandemic, so it was like a different kind of scenario where I was obviously going to work, so I was gone a lot of the time, and so a lot of time it was my wife with the baby, and then oftentimes one of our parents, or like one of the sisters or whatever, and the parent was usually like my mom or her mom. And so there was a time where Evie, especially, actually this is when Julie started to go back to work, and then Evie was going to my wife's mom's 3 days a week, my mom 1 day a week, and then Julie's sister, like her aunt's 1 day a week. Right, so that's a pretty involved relationship with the grandma at that stage. And then obviously that's obviously just one example. Obviously there's examples of where grandma's much more involved. And just keep in mind, I'm resisting saying full custodial, because that's obviously another scenario. Like grandma could be completely raising the child too, right? And so this is sort of the point I was saying there, is that like sometimes also grandma will be like completely raising the child. Maybe mom's having, oftentimes if mom's unmarried, and it can kind of be, as you can probably think through, for more positive or more negative reasons, right? Maybe mom's really struggling with certain things around mental health, or with substances, or maybe with relationship stability, and all kinds of things that life can throw at us. And maybe grandma's now, and usually grandma is involved now, just statistically, in raising the child. It can also be in a different direction though, right? It can also be mom going back to school, mom trying to establish a career, mom trying to get on a healthy path. So it can kind of be in either of those scenarios, and all along the spectrum. This is an interesting point, right? It's like, and again, this comes to like when you ask people what they think of when they think of their grandma and what kind of things you did with their grandma, and and then you ask them the same thing about their grandfather, it's kind of interesting to think that like people tend to have, just at a kind of basic level, a more broad description of what grandma was. I want you to think about that idea for a second. Just think about if that rings true to you or not. For most adults in middle age, grandparenthood's not the central part of their life. So like that's where I was like earlier, I was talking about that thing about my grandma playing basketball and how much that blew my mind. Like, grandma played basketball? How did I never know that? How did I never have her friends in high school or grade school, I forget, were like commenting on her basketball skills? Like how, and she was like one of my favorite people. How did we never talk about basketball? It's like I didn't even know about that part of who she was. So, and sometimes I know that it would kind of look better as a video if I went point by point, but then if I forget to put up a point, it messes up the recording. So it's kind of just to make it error proof, because I tend to make that mistake. Okay, so sometimes, or this word filial responsibility means basically just this sense of responsibility to take care of your family, right? Your lineage. When parents need help, that the children are trying to provide it, and it's like different cultures have different amounts of focus on that kind of thing. I also wanted to present this idea of like, think of how different the what an elder is. And I think one of the, without going on a huge rant on this, although I will next week, I think that that's one of my big critiques of our society is our inability to correctly integrate our elders. For most of human history, the elders have been much more involved in child development for almost obvious reasons. Now, I don't know how that works in a modern city. But again, it's like, I think the potentials for programming in those areas in the future are very interesting. And especially if you're looking at it from like a kind of therapeutic recreation perspective, it's like we know that, like, say for example, elderly people reading to groups of children is psychologically therapeutic for both sides. And more so for the reader, right, for the older person, but it's so, because it's not just like, it's not necessarily as psychologically significant maybe in terms of like mental health for the kids, but it's just such good role modeling. And again, like my point is, after all of the delays that kids have been experiencing, everything should be about phonics right now. Everything needs to be about phonics. We need to catch kids up with reading, because if kids can read, they can participate. They have a chance at school. That's my personal mission right now. It's like, you have to like turn my mic off if the topic of phonics comes up. It should be the only thing people are talking about in terms of, not in general, but in terms specifically of how to catch up for lost time. I've used this picture for years, and I've always just found this picture like tough to look at. Just picture that, like, I can read so much into this picture, right? I don't even remember where I originally got this picture. Probably, I don't know if it was provided by the book or whatever, but because oftentimes I like craft, like I'll kind of craft. Anyways, I don't need to explain how I make PowerPoints just randomly, but yeah, note the love and the exhaustion. You know, maybe this is the woman's mom, and maybe the mom's starting to forget her. Maybe that woman worries about the mom all the time, but is also frustrated, and is also fighting with her husband at home about something. again, I'm making all this up, and is worried about her kid's school. And her boss is on her about something that she needs to get done. And then her car's making a noise. But if she doesn't go, no one sees her mom. And it's her mom. I think this is an important topic. I think this is so important for all of you CHFS students. Like, it's not just caring for the older people. I think that they're, because what I'm basically saying, I'm trying to kind of in the moment articulate something that I haven't really thought through yet, but there's all this, Canada's an aging population. And what that's going to mean is there's going to be demand for services for that population. And I don't mean just like, oh, you should be like aiming businesses at it, but I also sort of am saying that because there's going to be a lot of opportunity to do things to add meaning to these people's lives and to add therapeutic value, and also to support the people that are supporting them. And I think it's important, if you're at a stage where you're kind of getting ready to begin your career, to be aware of the demographic trends in your country, right? And like the fact that if your plan is to work with people, well, the majority of the people that will be available to work with are going to be young or old. And that's just the statistics of what our country is looking like right now. I think there's all kinds of interesting things you could do with older populations. There's all kinds of things you could do around meaningful engaging the emotional and memory systems, like even things with like virtual reality, and having them in a virtual reality night where they have like a 50s movies or a 50s Elvis night, and everything is, and they watch Elvis in VR, and it's like he's singing right to them, and then they go and they eat the foods they used to eat, and the music's on that they used to have, and they would have things that identify with that, and it's like it's almost magic what that does to the brain. I'm getting like all emotional today. I don't know why. Interesting times. Caregivers more often don't have children at home, tend to live closer to their aging parents. Usually it's the daughter or daughter-in-law. Right, and then I just had that idea that intervention can help like ease caregiver burden. And it's like, yeah, but I think that we haven't even scratched the surface of what that sentence could be. And that's sort of what I've been ranting about in this slide, is like there's all kinds of innovative potential in the vacuum that exists there. Whether you wanted to have art programs or animal-based things or nature-based things where some of you live, or like you should be integrating that. You live in a beautiful area. It's like people need the visual. Sorry, I'm getting all excited, but people need the visual therapy of seeing trees and just there's just an idea, I guess. It's kind of interesting presenting like this because I never know, like that last slide, I all of a sudden like got all emotional, and I got to be honest that sometimes if that happens, I definitely feel the urge to immediately delete that slide and do it again. But at the same time, don't know. I think there's a value in trying to be honest and truthful, and that even if it makes you present yourself like a little more vulnerable or less polished than your ego would like. And so anyway, so the story I want to tell about this. So my grandma, who is like one of my favorite people, my mom's mom, Grandma T, who I've been talking about, and I have a whole bunch of cousins on that side. Like my mom had 8 siblings, and they all have kids, and we're at this Christmas event right before she died, and I can just remember that, and she remembered me pretty good right till the end, because I was the oldest. I'm the oldest of the grandkids, and I remember sitting there with her. She'd like scratch my back. I was like sitting with her, and she'd like, and my brother came up, and my brother was like talking to her, and they were chatting, and then he left, and she looked at me and said, "That's a nice young man." That was brutal, right? Because obviously that implies that she didn't know who he was. Which is the rationale behind this image. So Alzheimer's is like a lot of these things. It's somebody's last name, a doctor that found the sort of, well, coined the term or labeled the condition where it's this progressive, right? So it keeps getting worse. Irreversible, meaning it's only going one way towards getting worse. Brain disorder that's characterized by this gradual deterioration, or like how it deteriorates memory, reasoning, language, and eventually physical functioning. So devastating. Such devastating things to interfere with. The most common type of dementia. Once destruction of brain tissue occurs from Alzheimer's, it's unlikely that the treatment will ever reverse, according to our current level of science. I actually just saw a wild thing in was it Tech Insider or Science Tech, one of the magazines, about these worms that have, if you just Google Alzheimer's and like worms and new research, you'll find that there's some like, and it's like, what about worms? It's something about the genetics. It's at the genetic level. If there's ever going to be a cure for Alzheimer's, it'll be genetic. It'll be some kind of gene therapy. And it's probably going to have to do with this very specific thing called tau, T-A-U. This, which is the name of it's just the chemical name of or it's just the, not chemical name, it's just the name of a very specific protein molecule that seems to act a certain way in people that have Alzheimer's. And to show you that, I'm going to show you that with a video that depicts it. So if you look at this, right, you can see that the brain on the right shows a slice of the brain ravaged by Alzheimer's, whereas the photo on the left is a more normal aging brain. I think it's powerful to just visually see what Alzheimer's looks like and see how physical of a thing it is. Alright, my friends, I have a short video here that's really interesting. That's an animation on this Dow protein idea, and then there's just a short message from my daughter at the end. I love you. See you next week, and stay well.
Over a century ago, a German doctor called Alois Alzheimer spotted anomalies in brain sections from a patient with dementia. Ever since, people have been studying the strange plaques and tangles that he saw, in the hope that we could one day understand and cure what is now known as Alzheimer's disease. Plaques are insoluble deposits of a peptide called amyloid beta, or A-beta. They're formed when a protein called amyloid precursor protein is sequentially cleaved by two enzymes, beta and gamma secretase. Other molecules are generated by this cleavage and may play a role in the disease, but A-beta is the main culprit. A-beta tends to misfold and become sticky, eventually clumping together to form soluble oligomers. Some of these aggregate into large insoluble fibrils that deposit in the brain as plaques. The oligomers come in several forms or species. We don't know exactly which species are toxic, but research shows that they weaken communication and plasticity at synapses. This could be what stops the brain from forming or retrieving memories. Neurons aren't the only cells affected in Alzheimer's disease. Astrocytes and microglia also play a role. Microglia are immune cells that clear out waste and prune synapses during development. Microglia take up A-beta, but they also get activated by it, triggering the release of inflammatory cytokines that can damage neurons. The microglia also start to remove synapses by phagocytosis. As synapses start to malfunction and neurons die, abnormal patterns of activity emerge, and eventually the brain can't process and store information properly. Another key feature of Alzheimer's disease is neurodegeneration. Neuronal death and damage is triggered by A-beta, but some of A-beta's effects seem to be mediated by another protein seen in the brains of patients, tau, a component of tangles. In a healthy neuron, molecules are carried along the axon on a series of tracks, made of microtubules and stabilised by tau. But in Alzheimer's disease, tau is modified, causing it to dissociate from the microtubules, adopt an abnormal shape, and move from the axon to the cell body. Like A-beta, tau comes in a variety of forms, and we don't know which ones contribute to the disease. And like A-beta, these forms either remain soluble or stick together and deposit as the tangles that Dr. Alzheimer saw. Eventually, these processes kill the neuron. Another problem, seen in animal models, is that misfolded tau proteins can spread across synapses into healthy neurons. There, they make healthy tau proteins start to misfold as well, spreading pathology across the brain. The pattern of spreading through the different brain regions matches the changing symptoms from early to late stages of Alzheimer's disease. This pattern also reflects how certain neurons are more vulnerable than others to dying. Despite these advances in our understanding of Alzheimer's disease, no cure exists. While drugs are being developed to target amyloid beta or tau, it's unclear whether they will eventually be successful in treating the disease. There's only one certainty. Continued support for basic and clinical research will enable us, one day, to diagnose and treat this devastating condition.
Hi. No.
Yeah, go.
Hi. Thanks for watching. Have a great weekend.